see there, every slide has a nice big image. I'll probably make reference to those because they're more interesting than the text. And we'll see where we go. So first of all is Blackfriars Bridge in Southwark, nice and wide, separated from traffic, separated from people walking, all very comfortable and safe, and kind of attractive, interesting views, interesting buildings. So you'll see that come through in the 5 principles. So the 5 principles are coherence, the Dutch use the term cohesion, directness, safety, comfort and attractiveness. Nice photo there of a protected junction on Lee Bridge Road in Waltham Forest in London. Safe for anybody to use, very logical where people go. You can do your right turn in one traffic light cycle, kind of thing we should be building. And we can build it, it is now in the UK. The 5 principles come from the Dutch Crow Design Manual for Bicycle Traffic. Lots of UK guidance make reference to them. There's lots of walking guidance that makes reference to them. So what the Crow says is, in general, it holds that if the minimum level cannot or can no longer be met, one or more of the 5 main requirements, then the infrastructure will need to be modified. And that's where you get into the compromises. What is the minimum that people can cope with? What's kind of a critical fail, that sort of thing. So we'll start with coherence, and this is about the infrastructure forming a coherent whole, and it links all origins and destinations. So if you're cycling, you're trying to get from A to B, you probably don't want to go via C too often. You want it to be nice and obvious where you should be cycling to. Nice example from Grove Road, Grove Crescent in Stratford. What you can see in the distance is a cycle track on the main road, and it curls into a side road, which is Grove Crescent itself. Doesn't matter which class of road it's on, everything's nice and coherent where you should be going. Good example here from Copenhagen. So coherence isn't just about the cycle routes themselves, it's about the destinations, it's about integrating with other things. Side streets and main roads are needed as part of the network. So there's lots of talk about trying to fit routes around back streets exclusively. It doesn't work because the destinations aren't normally on back streets. Putting routes through parks might be nice. No good if the parks close at night and you can't go shopping in the park. If there's large gaps, that reduces your cohesion. But the big principle here is destinations are everywhere. People are going from A to B. We have to tackle significant barriers. So if there's big railways or rivers, canals, big roads, at some point these barriers need to be dealt with. I've mentioned the trains in Copenhagen. So this is about seamless integration with other transport networks. And as you can see in the photo of Whitechapel Road in Tower Hamlets, streetworks can impact this coherence. So in this particular example, this is Cycle Superhighway 2, which runs east-west through that part of London. If you get to this particular position, it's the only main cycle route in the area. Where do you go? Where's the coherence gone? If you're using a cargo cycle, maybe dismounting using the footway isn't going to work for you. So, directness. The cycling infrastructure always offers the cyclist as direct a route as possible, and that means keeping detours to a minimum. Nice photo here from Fryeburg in Germany. This is kind of a main superhighway style route. This particular road happened just to be a cul-de-sac that they've filtered out. You can see on the floor big marking to show that's two-way for cycling. I won't try and translate any of that, but essentially there's a cycle route which goes through all different classes of road, giving a very direct route, whereas traffic goes the long way around. So implications of directness, that affects the macro and the micro level. So a route across the city has to be direct, but also the route through a complex signal junction needs to be direct. We can measure it in time as well as distance. So a longer route might actually be shorter in terms of time. So if you're avoiding a big junction or something complicated, it might just work out better. Just Street in Camden is a really good example of directness. So in the distance, there's a cycle track on each side of the road, going off and away around the side of the station. In the foreground is Just Street itself, which is a modal filter with traffic lights. So the network, again, it's ignoring kind of the class of road. It's providing this direct link through to where people need to go. It has to be quicker than the car. If cycling is going to compete, it has to be the quicker mode. Junctions. So we need priority through junctions. And we must remember that traffic management generally is a product of motorisation. So traffic signals, regulations, signs, parking management, all this stuff is to manage motor traffic. If you just stick a load of cyclists together, you don't need to signalise them. Good example here of a junction which is not direct, and this is the front of my cargo bike. So I'm expected here to go around the corner, cross that first stage crossing on the left, which is then staggered on a fairly narrow island, and then cross the second one. What I actually tend to do at this junction, because I know what the signals are doing, is from that position I go straight out to the hatched area, and then just give way to traffic coming from my left, unless I get a second green man on the other side. So an indirect two-can crossing, you have to wait for ages, and it just doesn't prioritise cycle traffic. Attractiveness. This is about the cycling infrastructure being designed and fitted in with its surroundings in such a way that it's appealing or attractive. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It may just be an interesting place, maybe good architecture, post-industrial with interesting buildings to look at, or it may be like this street here again in Fryeburg. This is just a fully filtered neighbourhood, kind of a play street type approach in this particular location, but it's an attractive street, and it's not just the fact it's green. The buildings give a sort of sense of enclosure to the street itself, and it's just a pleasant place to cycle. So probably more subjective. So some of the key things about being attractive is having a smooth asphalt surface. For me, that's really, really key because we're trying to make riding effortless. Good example of that here on Bristol Road in Birmingham. They're one of their blue routes. Machine laid, fairly wide, a really nice cycle route to cycle along. You're not wasting energy, getting vibration for your hands. There's no potholes. That's what we should be aspiring to. The routes need to be legible. So if you're coming up to a junction, it should be obvious where you're going. So you don't have to worry too much about the layout. You can just flow through the junction yourself. That legibility, it gives you the opportunity to make your decision before you arrive somewhere. So if you get to a junction, there's a sign and it's a really complicated route through, it's just not attractive. Is there direct access at destination? So is there cycle parking right outside the door to the building you're going in? Can we escape the monotony? So if it's a cycle route next to a dual carriageway, it's boring, it's the same for miles upon miles. What interesting things are there? So Marine Parade in Great Yarmouth is an unsung hero of cycle tracks, really. Very few people have ever heard of it. It's really weird. It's a nice section, maybe a mile long. Doesn't really connect to anything at any end. I don't know why they gave up on it. It may not be everybody's cup of tea going past amusement arcades and piers and things like that, but it's certainly an interesting and lively place. So you could go along there on a crowded day. You've got your own space, and there's people. It's overlooked. It doesn't feel lonely. The next principle is safety, which is quite important, obviously. This is about the cycling infrastructure guaranteeing the road safety and health of cyclists and other road users. This is one of my very favourite filters. There's at least one person on this call that will be smiling now with me showing this. This particular road, Cedar Road in Romford, runs parallel to the A12. And for years and years, it was used as an extra lane to the A12 for people trying to avoid traffic queues. Scheme went in with some controversy as an experimental traffic scheme. Lots of noise around it. To be absolutely fair to the politicians at the time, they held their nerve and the thing got made permanent. And it went down from something like 4,000 vehicles a day down to a couple of hundred a day. So on figures, that was proven right, and the through traffic had to stay back on the A12, which is a trunk road. So it's a nice route, nice and safe, and it feels safe. But the implications for safety, objective safety, and that's about collision risk, designing out those interactions with fast and heavy traffic, and having design details which don't create a risk. In the photo there, you can see a gently sloping, forgiving curb. So the idea with this is, if you're cycling along the cycle track, you get too close to the curb and you touch it, that slope isn't going to throw you off your bike. If you had, say, a 25 mil, 50 mil vertical upstand and you clip that, you'd be off your bike. Subjective safety is about how something feels, and that's probably quite a difference between day and night, sometimes called social safety. Safety is also about low exposure to pollution, and that's either being completely away from traffic or having decent buffers. Junctions are where the risk is the highest, so they need to be legible and safe and easy for people to use. And there's a big focus here on not mixing modes. So that's part of the Dutch approach to sustainable safety, where essentially, if you've got a speed differential, you separate the modes. So walking and cycling are separated, cycling and motor traffic are separated. Really good example of a Dutch rural roundabout here in the south of the Netherlands. What you can see here is it's a shared use path, essentially. It's a cycle track, but people can walk on it. You're taken across the road in two halves. There's only one traffic lane to cross at one time. The geometry of the roundabout really slows drivers down. It flows really well, but you have to go around it carefully. There's an adverse camber on the roundabout, which throws drivers the wrong way, which forces them to slow down. And the crossing point, crucially, is set back from the circle. So if somebody does start to cross, a driver has time to slow down and stop. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine, so I'll compare it with the UK roundabout. This is Buckton Road in Cambridgeshire. So what we do is we have high speeds into and out of the roundabout. We make people cross by the circle and not set back. And we quite often make them cross more than one lane at once. So you can see the entrance in the distance is 2 lanes and the exit in the foreground, which is a lane and a hatched bit. When that's going and busy, it's really hard to find a gap. No space at all for a driver to slow down without staying on the roundabout. It's a subjectively unsafe layout. Perfectly acceptable. It's done all over the place. So yes, one of my little bugbears is UK roundabouts, which we do need to change. And now we can talk about comfort. And this is about infrastructure that essentially it minimises nuisance to somebody cycling along. So what we have here is at Gasper Park, just on the outskirts of Amsterdam. This is like the last metro station to the south. You've got a nice cycle track with cycle parking, entrance straight into the station, completely away from traffic. Now, just out of a shot on the right, there's actually a little bus station and drop-off point for cars, but there's no mixing at all. It's a nice, comfortable, and again, safety and attractiveness, it all kind of comes into one here. So implications for comfort. So yeah, we're away from other traffic. Mixing with busy traffic is tiring. How can we minimize those interactions? The Chrome manual suggests that if people are forced to stop to get going again, that's about 75 to 100 meters worth of effort to get going. So if you had a 3-kilometer route with 10 stops, it could feel more like a 4-kilometer route in terms of energy. The photo is of Exhibition Road, Kensington and Chelsea in London. This is one of the quiet ways in London. I don't think anybody would particularly like to be mixing with the traffic there. It's a terrible, terrible street, very controversial, and I like to wind up urban designers by saying how terrible it is. It's an expensive, big shared slab, completely unsuitable for families and for most people, really. Comfort's also about being legible, so people don't like getting lost. It's a big worry for people. So if the route's legible, you can see landmarks. So it's not just about signage, it's also about clear landmarks that people can form this mental map in their mind. That makes for a comfortable journey. We need smooth all-weather surfacing. Having unbound materials is just not accessible to everybody. We need to make sure things are properly drained and managed, and also minimising turns where possible, because again, this is about getting lost, slowing down, losing energy. Again, with a back street route, if you have one sign missing or a cycle logo missing on the carriageway, you're lost, and people give up. Really nice example of a street in Malmo. This is a shopping street, but you're allowed to cycle in there. Traffic's banned during the day. It's the kind of street you'd use in a city, getting that mental map going. So you'd use that maybe rather than going on a main road, just because it's a nice place to be. So that's the 5 principles. I'm just going to look very quickly on something about the balance. So that's kind of my day job, the day job of planners. The balance is it's pushed within time, so that could be time within signals. We've obviously got space at junctions and cycle track widths and general geometries we're playing with, and also the politics. But if we drop too far below a minimum standard on any of those 5 principles, then there's a network gap. So where can we compromise? Useful to mention Stevenage. Completely separate network, feels really, really safe, really comfortable. The problem with it is it's quite a sprawling town. It's not very dense. It can be a bit long and boring cycling along some of the big roads they've got there. And it's completely incoherent because the town centre bans cycling, which is quite odd for a place that's developed like this. So some of my views on balance. If we have a short section where comfort and attractiveness is reduced, if it's still safe, it's still direct, and it's still coherent, so people can understand it, they can understand the compromise as well, and maybe see the end of that, then that's okay. If there's a longer route to avoid a big junction, so we may have some grade separation, the actual, as the crow flies, directness has been eroded, but the other principles are enhanced. So it's quiet, it's away from pollution, and it's a nice place to be. That probably trumps the slightly longer route. Good example of this happening kind of in the short term. This is Royal Mint Street in Tower Hamlets. Again, this is Cycle Superhighway 2, roadworks going on. And what they did is they prioritised maintaining the cycle route through the area. The road was actually close to general traffic while they did all the work on this particular building. So it may not be that attractive to experience, but you can see the end of the tunnel. You know it's kind of sporadic, but it's still direct. You still feel safe. So the compromise hasn't gone too far. Sacrificing safety will discourage people. You might have a fantastic scheme, but if there's a really dangerous junction that you have to go through, or you're completely exposed to traffic, that's somewhere that people don't want to be. And also, it's very, very important. We shouldn't be drawing people who are walking into big compromises. And if things have to give, it's the space for motors. And if the issue you're trying to solve doesn't work at the local level, then the solution is probably at your network level. So you need to zoom out, change how the network operates to deal with your problem. A nice scheme, sort of mix, I guess, Bradford Street in Birmingham, which is a pop-up scheme in response to COVID. Quite nice, quite safe and comfortable, but look at that bus stop. Bus pulls in at the bus stop cage there. You're expected to cross on the zebra straight into the bus or straight off the bus. Birmingham have admitted it's an issue. It's something they've picked up in kind of a big review of what they've done. But Bradford Street, hopefully, is going to be rebuilt a bit more permanently, and those sort of issues will be dealt with. But yeah, we've got quite a nice route here, fairly quick to put in, but it's compromised pedestrians or bus passengers in this case. So this is the acid test of the 5 principles. You see people of all ages cycling. You see people using non-standard and adapted cycles. People cycling side by side, having a chat, which is an absolute canary in the mine. And if people do make mistakes, they're forgiven. Doesn't matter who it is. They make a mistake, they're not going to get hurt through it. And probably here, children being children in perfect safety is a fantastic example here. From Victoria Embankment to Westminster. How he managed to do a wheelie on a hire bike, I've absolutely no idea. but completely safe, and he can mess around without being put at risk. So I'm just going to kind of blast through low traffic neighborhoods a little bit. So they can be part of cycling networks and cycle routes, but they're not cycling infrastructure as such. They're not anything new. They've been around for decades and decades. It's just we've called them something now. We've called them low traffic neighborhoods, and all the controversy sticks to the definition. But if we design them well, they can be a seamless part of the cityscape, and these will meet the 5 principles. A fantastic example of this, Francis Road, Waltham Forest. General traffic's banned during the day. The whole area is filtered, so even out of hours, you only need to be there if you need to be there to deliver or whatever. It's safe, it's comfortable, it's legible, it's attractive, it does everything you need it to do. So just the case, so a little one for you guys. There's no data for Oxford itself, but this is for the county. So the graph shows at the top is what's happened with all motor vehicles from about 1994 to the left out to 2018-19 on the right. And you're running at, I don't know, about 4,750 millions of vehicle miles in 2019. Cars and taxis are the green line at the bottom, and again, probably since about 2012, things have been growing. There's probably going to be another blip because of COVID, but the indications are things keep growing. So what are you going to do with all this traffic, especially when it starts trying to blast into Oxford City? So is it actually a national policy to grow motor traffic? Because the forecasts are that it always grows. The forecasts often get things wrong, but certainly outside of London, traffic is growing. But then forecasts are based on policy, so it's kind of a chicken and egg spiral here, really. The forecasts come from reviewing the policies. The policies, well, the forecasts are saying things are expanding, we need to do more, and it goes round and round and round. And if you do download the slides, there is a link there to where this data comes from. Something I've taken from Oxford City Council's website, which is interesting given that you've had a bit of a change in what's happening at county level. But for Oxford itself, apparently more than 60% of all journeys into Oxford are done by car. So unless you do something, you're in trouble. So the city, I think, recognises a problem, at least it does in the stuff it's published. Are the city's plans bold enough? And I guess it's questions I'm throwing out to you guys. Are the city's plans being supported by the county council, who are the highway authority? As I say, they may now change with the politics. Is there action? Well, you've got 3, I think, experimental low traffic neighbourhoods around Cowley, which has been going since about February with some tweaks. So something's happening. Whether they'll stick, you tell me. So LTNs, as you probably know, make use of modal filters. So we're allowing walking and cycling through, but we're managing or restricting motor vehicles. And for cycling, this should be seamless between cycle tracks or main roads and quiet side streets. Good example again from Waltham Forest. They seem to have all the good examples, but Whitney Road, you essentially cycle through this really nice filter, and just beyond the bollards, you hit a cycle track. So it's completely seamless how you get through there. And in fact, you can just see in the middle of the photo, there's a little green sign telling you which of the main cycle routes it is. I kind of specified different types of filters. So you've got heavy, medium, and light, really. So heavy is your fixed things, stuff that's in concrete and tarmac. Medium are things that can be moved, so fire gates, lockable bollards, stuff like that. And light filters are things like weight limits done by signs, or maybe where you're enforcing by cameras. Each have got their sort of advantages and disadvantages depending on the context. Example here, Maidstone Road in Enfield. part of a few controversial LTNs in Enfield, but they're holding their ground. And this is a heavy restriction, so it is fixed bollards and planters. There's not even emergency access really through that particular one. You can take the bollard out if you've got the right key, but the emergency vehicles in this case will come in a different direction. So things to think about. Heavy and medium style filters will physically deal with that traffic. The medium type of filter, it can allow emergency access, and that's generally the fire brigade. Different emergency services in different areas might have slightly different views, but generally it's the fire brigade who will open things up. It's not normally immediately in response to an emergency. It's normally sometime in, so there's a fire going on, they need to bring in resources from a different direction. That's when they start opening gates and bollards, generally speaking. We can have light filters now using ANPR cameras. So that just means emergency vehicles can get through. We can allow refuse vehicles, blue badge holders, permits. We can play around with the timing of the restrictions. Unfortunately, the law hasn't caught up on camera enforcement yet across the whole of the country, which is a bit of a problem. ANPR has a long-term revenue cost, so it's kind of tempting to give residents permits, but that waters down the point of having LTNs. If people really comply well, you haven't got the fines coming in to cover the back office for these. So I would say they're only used in really proper circumstances. So bus gates, or if it's a location you really can't get the emergency vehicles through, that's probably where you go for an ANPR type of system. Bollards and lockable gates and things like that are vandalism risk. So the Cedar Road scheme I showed you earlier, the experimental version of that kept having the bollard unlocked and thrown in the local river. Local builder, we think, had a key. You can get them anywhere. So yeah, actually putting stuff in you can't move is probably a lot better. So as part of an overall network strategy, they can help people swap modes. They can give less friction at minor junctions. So what that means is people turning in and out of a side road to rat run. If you solve that, you're not having so many turning movements on the main road, which makes things flow a bit more smoothly. It's about reducing short trips by car. Heavy traffic stays on the big roads that they've been designed for, so they're structurally sufficient for the type of traffic. And also, if you've got urban traffic control using traffic signals, you can actually much better manage what's happening. So, for example, Lee Bridge Road, one of the big things they did as part of the scheme through there was upgrade all the signals. Because you haven't got all the rat running now, you can really manage the flow to give journey time certainty from end to end. Just a nice example from the centre of Utrecht, who've essentially taken all the through traffic out of the old city. You can still get in, there's a delivery van there, but vans are in the minority. There's lots of people cycling. It's a nice filtered shopping street in this particular case. So there's two ways of developing them, using experimental schemes. So you can put the scheme in, adjust it, consult on it as people are trying it and having lots of noise probably, with a decision made within 6 months, within 18 months. Or we have a permanent order which goes through the full design and consultation first, with a decision coming later. Good example here of sort of a temporary experimental scheme in Birmingham at Low Tower Street. This is actually part of their city segment scheme, which is effectively a massive LTN in the city centre within the main ring road. As a byproduct, this actually makes cycling across this junction safer because you don't have people coming off the main road. Filters and traffic cell size, so the cell within which people can access but not get to the next area needs some thought. So can you loop them through neighbourhoods to give easier routes for delivery drivers so they don't have to reverse? If the filters are actually at the boundary roads themselves, they need to be close enough to the junction to stop people trying to turn in. Nice example of a diagonal filter here in Dagenham. It just means that refuse truck drivers and the things and the services that have to go in don't have to reverse. They just drive in and drive out the other end. We should be trying to develop those traffic cells into areas which broadly have the same number of homes accessing a junction to spread the load, if you like, around the whole of the area. In general, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but once you get more than about a kilometre across, you'll start to find that residents in the far reaches will start driving those short trips again, because people are just people. And people like quiet streets, even if they don't know it yet. The example here from Leicester is decades old. You can see by the trees. I don't think anybody would cut those trees down and reopen that particular filter. The ultimate goal is traffic reduction. So as well as getting the traffic down in the neighbourhoods, we need to get it down the main roads and rebalance those for walking, cycling, buses. Some streets may not need a traffic function at all in the future, and a great example is the narrow way in Hackney. Used to be a really busy bus route, this area here. It's now completely pedestrianised. Cycling is allowed all the time, and buses are rerouted somewhere more suitable. And eventually the modal filters can be replaced, so you do end up with this space for parklets and other things in the street if you're not moving or storing vehicles so much. They can provide key parts of cycle routes, so still remembering coherence, because people need to be able to see where they're going and get from A to B. But somewhere like Newcomen Street here, which is Quiet Way 14 in London, it's part of a route which, again, it dies between different types of streets, but it's pretty coherent, quite useful. But what we mustn't be doing is getting people to the end of an LTN and dumping them on a main road and expecting them to cope with that as part of a cycle route. So again, apply the 5 principles that we've talked through before if LTNs are part of a cycle route. If they don't follow the 5 principles, then that may not be the best place for the cycle route. And really, just to prime up some questions or discussion maybe, or some thoughts. So what is the context for Oxford? Who is doing the driving? So you've got 60% of trips coming in. Who's doing all that? I've often heard about Oxford's notoriously narrow main roads. So how can they be treated? Is it a linear treatment, or is it a point treatment? Do you have the leadership and ambition in the city and the county? The slides can be downloaded at that web link. It's live now, so you can get hold of these. And just really to finish with this photo here at Utrecht at the station. What you have here is, in the foreground, is essentially a little road. It's a service road just serving a few houses. And where the people are cycling is a cycle track. It's completely seamless as far as cycling is concerned. And the modal filter is that sign with the bicycle on it. Nothing else is needed there. It's completely legible. You know where you're going. And it's been redesigned to make cycling easy to the station. And you've probably heard enough from me. Shall we have some questions?
Great, that was a really good talk and very exciting and inspirational. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I have a question. So, sorry, I've lost my window. So in terms of what's very difficult, I think, so being on the infrastructure planning group, is getting all of the right stakeholders in the room together, because there are many different parties involved with this sort of planning infrastructure, and like how many different groups. So we're aware of the highway, obviously highways people. If it's like a housing development, it's there are many different stakeholders, and I wondered what your experiences of bringing those stakeholders together are, if you have any advice on that kind of challenge of making, because sometimes you try and have a meeting and there are certain stakeholders that are unable to make it, or
I think really it's picking who you have at the same meeting in many ways. So if you've got a couple of noisy groups with different views, sometimes it's good to keep them apart, at least to start with, because you often find people becoming and drowning everybody out. If there's, say you've got families who might be interested, probably having the meetings at 7:30 on a Thursday in a pub is not going to get them there. It's quite interesting. Our local campaign group where I am, because of COVID, because I had a bit of a whinge, the meeting went from Thursday evenings to Saturday afternoons once a month. And we've got more people attending. Not huge amounts, but more than we had. So it's about having some flexibility and realizing that people have got different things going on in their lives. If you're trying to get in maybe, I don't know, community groups, again, it's just trying to make sure you know what makes them tick. So if you've got a group who are dead against a thing, so we've talked about low traffic neighbourhoods are a thing, what's the common ground with them? So are they worried about air pollution? Are they worried about road danger? Can you get a broad agreement of what the problems might be to start with before you start drilling down into the nuts and bolts of how things fit together? That there isn't an easy answer, but it's probably about knowing your audience.
Yeah, that's very good. Those are very good points. When it comes to like larger planning infrastructure meetings where like there's a new housing development, like often there are different aspects of the council that are involved, like the highways people. So architects are involved, the landscapers, and how do you bring those people together? It's a very good point you make about like listening to what people have to say individually. So if we're trying to, as a community, improve the cycling infrastructure, I guess it's good to hear individuals first and then bring them all together into a room. It's often I think in some of our infrastructure things, we're seeing that it's very difficult to get everyone together in one place.
Yeah.
And so everything's not always, it's a bit disjointed sometimes in terms of the infrastructure planning.
I think probably also from a campaigning point of view, just sort of realise you can do what you can do, because ultimately the city and the county council have got people employed to do the job. Possibly make friends with the development management team at the county, which is usually part of highways, because it's an unsung and really powerful person or people to deal with, because they are the ones from highways who speak to the developers. So if they know what you want, if they know what the plans are, then they've got a better chance of articulating them. The big problem is often development management teams tend to be pushed away to one side. Sometimes there are staff that have been there a long time, kind of, I wouldn't say put out to grass, but they've got a nice, easy sort of little number there. And I say that because I used to deal with development management, so I know what a Cinderella job it was, but it's really, really important, because you can sit there in meetings with architects and fold your arms and say, no, you're not going to do it, you can do it this way. And they kind of, okay, you might have arguments with the planners later, but you kind of set the scene for what happens after that. So they're probably good people to make friends with as an infrastructure group anyway.
Great. So I think there's quite a few questions that were going through during the presentation. I think the first one I recall seeing was about getting bikes on buses, and that aspect. So you showed the trains in, I think it was Denmark, having provision for bike spaces on trains. I think that's something that is, I think, particularly challenging. You used to have the old guard carriages on trains, and there's another stakeholder involved there. It's very difficult, like to at the moment these new trains often haven't got the right provision. There's a train that's they say 1% of people are cycling when they build these trains. And so a 400-person train has up to 4 bike spaces, and that's can be severely limiting. I used to do journeys to and from Southampton every week, and it was always pot luck whether you could get on a particular train. I guess so that person was asking about joining up all of the infrastructure. I guess that's a longer term thing, because there's the buying a train is quite an expensive thing.
Yeah.
But that kind of lobbying, how would you suggest like trying to lobby to improve, to allow bikes to be like putting racks on the front of buses? That's a difficult one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, with trains, stuff is ordered years in advance. It gets delivered and it's with us for years, decades and decades. My local railway is Crossrail. I can't take a full-size bike on there at peak times anyway, and even getting a folding bike on sometimes is a bit of a challenge. So I imagine, so Copenhagen on the metro isn't isn't kind of crushed like that, and they've specifically set aside the carriages. It may be more like a Dutch model, where generally speaking, you're going to cycle to the station, get the train, and perhaps have a second bike at the other end, or a hire bike, or just walk the last bit. So it depends on the city, it depends on the circumstances. The lobbying for that kind of thing probably going to have to be through MPs, I would have thought, just because of the circles it moves in. Probably buses, that's conversations you can have with the operators. I've got no idea whether it's illegal or not. People are talking about it in the chat. I thought in Scotland you can take a bike on a bus, certainly actually within the vehicle. Some buses have been designed that way, but have those conversations. But don't forget, the commercial operators are trying to pick the best routes because it's not regulated in the way it is elsewhere. They want the best routes, the most passengers, and bikes are kind of something in the way. So probably have those conversations with them to start with. We won't crack it overnight for sure.
Great. Please do pick out questions as you see them.
Shall I pick, I'll pick Graham Smith's question, because he always asks this on everything I've ever been on about your 7.3 metre wide carriageways. So I might try and answer that for Graham, because it is a really tricky one. So at 7.3, you can't fit a cycle track on both sides of the street. What you could do is actually make it one way, and that frees space up. But his specific question is, if there's nil alternatives and it's busy, can advisory coloured lanes be made to work? So if you've got essentially you paint cycle lanes on both sides of the street, and oncoming vehicles stay in the middle of the space and then move into the cycle lane when they meet another vehicle. You can do that probably on low flows. So if it's a busy road, it's just not going to work, because you can forever have cars in the cycle lane, and it's just going to degrade the point of doing it. There is guidance certainly in the Crow manual on doing that, but it's kind of almost like a last resort, really. Not really seen it done here in the UK where it works really well. I think for someone like Oxford, and Oxford is not unusual. I know people like to think it is, but there's other places where you've got this type of situation. I think the solution's at network level. So maybe this road here, or this route here, is the primary cycle route, and the route over here is a primary bus route, and that's where the compromise must come in somewhere. But that needs a bit of city planning rather than just say, right, how do we solve that particular street on its own? But as Graham will know, there's not an easy answer to that one, and I've probably fudged it a bit, to be fair. Point about smooth surfaces. Yeah, smooth surfaces, not chip surfaces. I think that's Claire talking about coming in. So they lay the road surface and the chips come in afterwards. I'd agree with that. Anything else which is a question? Lots of chat rather than questions there, so forgive me if I just scroll through it. Yeah, someone's picked up on this point about the energy when you stop. I think that's something that people don't look at enough. So when you've got even the most basic shared use path, if you're giving away every junction and those junctions are a bit busy, then that's energy every single time. So it's probably worth doing that calculation. Look at the route, measure the length of it, then count the stops and multiply each stop by 100 meters. Then go back to the promoter and say, well, your route is actually this long in terms of energy. You need to change that. Yeah, slides are on the link as I put at the end. Question. So the question, or the point someone's making here, is Tarek's making, is in his area where he works, the emergency services all object to physical barriers. Is there any evidence that they actually cause delays? That's probably, there's a recent paper by Rachel Aldred that looked at that. I'm pretty sure that was out in the last few weeks, and there isn't any evidence. There's a freedom of information request in the borough you're thinking of, Tarek, to the fire brigade, and they said that it hadn't caused any delays. So you can definitely push back there. I think what you get sometimes is, so this goes back to your point there about stakeholders. If you've got the fire brigade there and that particular rep is more interested in maybe the view as somebody who might drive everywhere, they can have those prejudices brought in to the conversation. Ambulance crews can be quite opinionated sometimes. The police generally don't often care. The traffic police will take some sort of interest. But yeah, the first question back is, okay then, where's the evidence that they do cause problems? The biggest problem is they're getting stuck on main roads, not getting through on those. So yeah, maybe that's a conversation to have. Are there any bike-friendly roundabouts in the UK? Findon Road in Cambridge is the very first Dutch-style roundabout we've got, which I haven't visited yet, so hopefully we'll be putting that right in a couple of weeks. Here's a really good question. This is from Emma Bryn, sorry. How do you think we should overcome the general opposition and aggression towards cyclists and new cycling infrastructure in general? I would go and look at the Bike is Best campaign run by Adam Tranter, who I did see him pop up on the call earlier. And I think it was something like in the market research Bike is Best did, all this stuff we're talking about is something like 65% of people outweigh support it. So the noise you get is a minority with this sort of stuff. I mean, they are very noisy, but more people than not support this kind of things. How does the Chrome manual line up to LTN 120? And how can we expect or persuade local planners to use LTN 120 properly? I would say, yeah, so LTN 120 possibly is a fairly similar type of structure. It hasn't got as much detail in terms of engineering layouts as Crow does. I would like to see another sort of manual which gives people a bit more of a clue on some of the design details, especially for designers, because designers will pick up a book. If they don't know anything else, they'll follow what's in there. So if we give them the right book, that'd be good. How can we persuade people to use it properly? That's a combination of awareness. So do the planners and engineers know it exists, because there's lots who don't. The DFT are currently working with Sustrans for some training for local authorities on LTN 120, and that'll be free to the local authority officers within limits of people. So that's worth watching out for. Perhaps from the planning side, to try and get it written into planning policy. That's one for lobbying councillors on. So if it's in planning policy, then it can be used for development planning, scheme planning and everything else. And as campaigners, maybe spend a bit of time reading it yourselves. It's pretty accessible in my view. Any more questions coming through?
I have one. So sometimes we come across planning applications for new housing developments, and often there's obviously sometimes money available to, or you can, I guess as a group we don't negotiate, but if there's a big housing development, let's say a few hundred people, or like 1,000 people for 1,000 people, how you negotiate payment of the infrastructure that goes in with that. So for example, in Ensham, there's a new housing development that's going in, and there was talk of part of the widening of the road to put a cycle route into Ensham from Oxford that would be paid for by I think it was by the housing association. I might be wrong on this, but, and then it kind of, or that plan got dropped because I think it was partly to do with the money, like the way the money was going to be spent. Like in essence, do you have any advice on when you propose things, how you can suggest it in a way that would be paid for as part of the housing development, even though it's sometimes like a highways piece of
Yeah.
infrastructure, but it could be paid for through different means. Do you have any advice on that kind of?
Yeah, I mean that's changing because the government keep playing around with how the planning system works in England, which is getting quite complicated to follow. But in essence, there's a test along the lines of is the development sort of sufficient in its current form, and if it's not, are there things that can be done that would make it sufficient in terms of planning policy? So often not having decent connections to sustainable infrastructure is a material planning consideration. So if you just propose a new road to connect something and it doesn't meet those other policy positions, then that can be so they can be told to go back and think again and resubmit something, or you can bind that into a legal agreement. So you've got planning permission, Mr. Developer, but in order to discharge all your responsibilities, you then have to build this thing as well, part of the scheme or separate or whatever. You can also have money set aside through agreement for, say, the county council to go and build something. Sometimes developers will do that because they know they can push the risk onto the county. So if the developer, their engineers look at it and they think, well, actually, there could be utility issues here. No, we'll give us some, and the county can worry about the risk. They're the discussions that go on in the planning meetings, or the day-to-day planning and development meetings. I just think, again, as campaigners, it should be pushing the agenda of what's needed and not being too bothered about who funds or how it's funded. You're not there to do the planning service for them. You're there to lobby. You're there to campaign. But getting to understand how the planning process is really useful. I don't know what the planning process is like at the moment in your area. Being two-tier, it's awkward because you've got the sort of city council role with its planning side and the county with its highway side. But yeah, get to know what the policies are, where you can apply pressure with those policies, that kind of thing.
Great. I think we've got a few more questions.
Yeah, I've got an interesting one about emergency services near hospitals here, which I thought was quite good. And the question is, it's from Cam A. On roads with heavy emergency service use, such as near hospitals, how do you allow cars to move over into the cycle lane to allow the emergency vehicles to get past, yet stop cars parking on the cycle lane during normal times, so it's curb protected? Really, the only way that you can get that to work properly is with like a step track. So the cycle track's higher than the road, but lower than the footway, say. But you'll never stop people parking on it. If you can get an emergency vehicle on it, you can get a car on it. So you'll never stop that. In Cambridge, they've got a curb called a Cambridge curb, which is gently sloped between the cycle track and the carriageway. And it's very, very easy to drive up. And the whole idea of that was that people can cycle and get in the road to overtake other cyclists, but also people can get out of the way of emergency vehicles. Actually, if you have a curb up stand of, say, 60, 70 mil cycle track to carriageway, somebody can bounce up that nice and slowly. It's not a particular problem. But you can never deal with all of those things in one go. So a step track is probably the way to do it, but you'll never stop people parking. Good. There's Graham. Graham's itching to ask a question. Hi, Graham.
Hi. Regarding emergency vehicles, one of the first traffic calm main streets in the country was in Boreham Wood, Shenley Road. And there they put a median down the whole length of Shenley Road. This is near Watford, so it's a car-dominated place. And the engineer in charge, when it was in, said that the emergency services thought the new system was fantastic, whereas car drivers were saying, you know, emergency vehicles get stuck in a single lane of cars. And he said what ambulances and police and fire engines do is that they put one wheel up the central median and scoot all the way down without no problem. And the engineer was claiming that the emergency services said it was better now than it was before. It's remarkable. We don't see much of that.
Well, one of the other advantages I've seen with cycle tracks, sort of step cycle tracks, is if you're really pinching general traffic into narrow lanes, you haven't got drivers kind of with different road positions. So as the emergency vehicle comes up, everyone's very regimented and they move out the way in a regimented way. So you haven't got one person who's so far across they can't move. So the cycle tracks do give the place for people to move out the way, for sure. There's a few questions and discussion about Botley Road in the chat, but I'm afraid I can't answer them because I don't really know the scheme.
So yeah, Botley Road has been replanned and replanned. There was a death on Botley Road, I think about 4 years ago now, and there was a charter called Claudia's Charter created to try and remember her and make sure it doesn't happen again. But yeah, there's a lot of narrow paths and posts in cycleways, and I haven't been on it recently. They're working on it all the time, and I haven't been on it recently either. But yeah, it's not perfect, let's say. But if you haven't been on it, it's hard to comment.
Yeah, maybe one to visit in the coming months.
Could I add to that? It's Alison Hill here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So we've been. I mean, it's part of the question I've put is the kind of real dislocation between the vision right through to implementation, and but where we see things failing at each stage. So I have this image of a blancmange where you where you have a perfect blancmange in the vision, and it's all, by the time it's all implemented, it's all melted and flat, and it's just the Botley Road went through the traditional consultations where they had a design and they presented it to us, and this happened twice. Everybody complained, but they still had the same design despite all the inputs from so many active travel groups. But at the very end, they introduced a thing called co-production, but it was too late in the day. And although we had some input onto the side road entries and things like that, it just, the whole thing really was shambolic, and all what they've done is just not working, and it just seems such a huge opportunity lost. But there is a very interesting new process which we're doing for the Woodstock and Banbury Road, which is co-production from the very start of the process. So no designs. The consultants are asking the active travel groups and bus companies to input at the very, very beginning of the process. And it seems to be, rather amazingly, so far, kind of quite optimistic on what the designs are coming out. And they seem to have listened. So, that there is a sea change in how the council is, we hope, with a hope that, but I mean, this is early days, but the way they're approaching active travel groups. And so it's kind of useful to get your thoughts on this whole issue of the kind of step change downwards of quality implementation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because so much stuff is done to people, and that's what gets people annoyed. I guess, one of the risks is having a conversation around whether we should or shouldn't do something, because you want to be in a position where it's, look, we've got 60% of people of trips into the city are driven. That's not sustainable. Forget about the environment. This is physically, you haven't got the space to deal with that. So are we all agreed we've got to do something? Yes, right, we'll tick that one off. Do we all agree that buses and cycles are going to be the main answer to get people in and out of the city, or at least take the pressure off the people who do drive further distances? Yes, okay, we'll tick that off. Right, now we'll agree on what the main issues are and the main ways to solve it. Then we'll get into the detail of planning out the route. So I think it's very important to have the conversation that, yeah, we will agree with something that's got to be done. If you're still debating, no, we shouldn't be doing it because I want to drive in from 30 miles away and not have to change anything, then that's not a conversation that's worth having these days. I think those days have to be behind us. Things have to change pretty radically in lots of places. Let's agree how we do it.
I agree, and I think that's I think we might be seeing change in Oxford. We fear that there may be many other places in the country that perhaps are not as fortunate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in the since I moved out of local government. I get to see quite a lot happening across the country now. It's really interesting as a consultant, I guess, from that point of view. And as a consultant, I'm tending to go and do work in places where people want to do stuff. So that's brilliant. I'm not really turning up to places to try and force them to do stuff they don't want to do, because they wouldn't have commissioned us otherwise. And you can see the difference where they've got some decent community engagement going. I mean, there's a really good question that's coming, which is kind of, I guess, off the back of that as the next stage. So Greg's has said, given top quality cycling infrastructure isn't cheap and council budgets are constrained, do I have opinions on the best way to do it? For want of a better term, on the cheap. Is there a balance to be struck between pushing for top quality infrastructure versus good enough but more? I would answer that probably in two ways. First, go back to those 5 principles. So is the cheap, the temporary, the not quite as pretty work, does that still tick those boxes? So is it safe? Is it coherent? Is it comfortable? If you're ticking most of those boxes off, then you're fine. If you're going to do something with limited budget, start at the junctions first, because that's where your risk is. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to put continuous treatments in the junctions. So you could, again, go back to the network level. You could have no entries into the side roads from the main roads where possible. So you're reducing the turning risk. Drivers coming out of the side road will be slow. They'll be looking, compared to drivers going off the main road. Have a look around Enfield in London and what they've done there. I don't agree with all of the treatments that they've put in, but they've kind of started at the junctions and spent the money there, and then worked out with lighter separation, different type of bolt down curbs and wands and stuff like that. That's quite a good way of doing it. And then also try and encourage or push for the local authorities to align their maintenance budgets. So maintenance goes on whether it's got lots of money or very little money, stuff has to be done. So can you have a plan that when the maintenance crews come in, actually, if the projects team can throw a bit of money into it, can you make a much better scheme being put back? So if you're going to resurface, well, actually, let's resurface and put some bolt down curbs at the same time. But you have to have a plan that's coherent to make that happen.
Greg had a good question about with cycling infrastructure not being cheap, budgets constrained, whether there's a balance to be struck and is good enough. The exact question is there a balance to be struck between pushing for top quality infrastructure vs good enough but more?
Yeah, I just think that if it does the job and it feels safe, that's good enough for now. You can come back and change stuff. It'd be lovely to go and completely rebuild entire streets, but I think at the moment with finances, that's going to be tough. There is money floating around, but it's probably not enough to do the big schemes at this stage. So yeah, I think LTNs have a big place to play in that, simply because you're managing the traffic at the side roads, which is one of your risks that you can take out.
Yeah, there's an interesting question about, are there any good roundabouts? Now, maybe you've seen, like, there's the Plane in Oxford, so it comes over Magdalen Bridge towards Cowley and Iffley Road. And I'm aware of a number of people just not being seen by cars on the roundabout, but it does get used a lot by bikes. It's heavily, like, a lot of people, it's one of the main roundabouts for cycling that people use traversing the city. So yeah, are roundabouts fundamentally good or bad, or like are there good roundabouts?
Is it, so in that particular example, people are cycling on the road with traffic then?
Yeah, it has segregated lanes, so you've got, like, there are cycle lanes in between cars, so you can have cars on either side of you and a cycle lane in the middle. But the problem is that a lot of buses need to change lanes to get to the various directions they're going, and they have to get in lane first of all. So as they're coming, they have a limited time before they're in the wrong lane, and it does get you, like, I'm aware of people getting slightly hurt, and I don't know, I haven't seen many roundabouts that have specific cycling lanes So yeah.
It sounds like a meat grinder to me.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, it probably works because the amount of people that you've got going through there for some reason. So
yeah.
if you've got lots of people cycling, more than the general traffic, that's probably why it works. But if you did that off peak, it probably feels less safe. I mean, really, there is guidance in LTN 120 about roundabouts. Generally speaking, unless you've got really, really massive volumes of people cycling and much lower volumes of drivers, it's either separating people out into proper cycle tracks, make a decision whether it should be controlled crossings or you give way as a cyclist. So the examples I gave from the Netherlands, the roundabout where you give way to traffic, those operate really, really safely. And most of the time you arrive at the give way point and you can find the gap. So that's the kind of thing to start with. I mean, Cambridge were bolder going with the parallel zebras. As far as I know, it's working. I've not seen any data yet. And you may look at it and think, well, actually, roundabouts aren't the solution. The Dutch tending to be going to put roundabouts in because they're the way they do them are much safer than signalised junctions, for example, for all users. So the traffic moves, it's safer for cycling. But yeah, you've got this decision. So the Dutch tend to do rural ones where you give way as a cyclist and you have priority in urban situations. There's arguments about that, but it's about convenience in cities then. But if you look at, I think LTN 120 is probably best to look at for roundabouts. But you've got conflict points. So as you're going round the roundabout as a cyclist and drivers are turning left to go off, every single time there's a conflict point. But yeah, the idea of being in the middle of everything doesn't sound to be much fun.
So yeah, it's hard. There's a lot of chat going on, so I'm just scrolling back through to see what we've missed.
There was the e-scooter question.
Yes, I did.
Kate Byrne.
Any comments? Do you have it in front of you, Andy?
Yeah, I see e-scooters and e-bikes being part of our transport in the future. Are we going to have to rethink cycle lanes to cope with them?
It's a really good question, actually, because I suppose we need to be careful with the terminology. So we use cycle lanes, cycle tracks, protection kind of interchangeably, but as a principal thing, what we'll probably find, or perhaps the way it should end up going, is we're probably going to be still building cycle tracks in cities and urban areas, and perhaps even in city centres, simply as a kind of halfway house between encouraging people in because they feel safe to be there, and that will include scooter users because, like it or not, they're here. It is going to grow, whether you want to use them or not. And as we squeeze traffic out, you'll get to a point where you've got a lot of people cycling, maybe using scooters, and a lot fewer people driving, and the balance will switch over. And then you'll start to see the cycle tracks as a hindrance. They're in the way that there's no place for them in the city anymore. And you'll probably go in there and start taking them out again. You'll probably be going into the cities and taking out traffic signals because with very few cars around, you don't need traffic signals between different streams of cycles. You may be going from signalised crossings back to zebras, simply so people can cross the road if you've got busy cycle traffic flows. There is some of that evidence in the Netherlands where Amsterdam has got some examples where things have flipped the other way, that in fact having all the traffic lights at the junctions are a big hindrance to the cycling scene now. So traffic's dropped off, they don't need the signals, out they come, and then things are so big we're going to reimagine the entire street and it's just a street, footways and a carriageway for cycles. But I still think we need to build stuff to get that critical mass before we take it out again. So maybe going back to the earlier question about is good enough, yes, and it might be easy to just sort of unretrofit, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Great.
I think it's probably time to, yeah, wind up.
Yeah, so we'll just hand over to Alison Hill, the Cyclops Chair, to make some closing remarks.
I've unmuted. So Mark, thank you hugely for your time here. I think there's so much food for thought, and we need to go through all the chat and just check that there are what questions are unanswered, because I think there are so many. There was a lot on there, and there is a huge amount that we need to take away in terms of thinking about our infrastructure group and how we respond to consultations, which is what Leo who's kindly joined that group, was saying at the start. So thanks hugely. I just want to finish with just a little celebration of, well, I probably shouldn't say that being a charity, but you can't help having a modest celebration about the fact that we have got a change in administration in our county. You pointed out, Mark, that it is a complex structure because we have a county council, which was until May the 6th, Tory administration. Therefore, all decisions in the city were being made by people who didn't live in the city, which really made that quite a tricky decision-making process. And the city itself was Labour run. Now we've got a new administration, and today we were told that we have got a Lib Dem, Green and Labour coalition which has formed, and we also know that who's going to be responsible for travel and development, and that's Duncan Enright from Witney, highways and maintenance Tim Bearder from Wheatley area, and climate change delivery and environment Pete Sudbury. All of those three are going to have transport function. So it's going to be quite a different political picture from now on. The Coalition for Healthy Streets and Active Travel, which is a group in the county of all active travel groups, did a survey of candidates, and you'll be glad to know that all those people who involved in transport strongly agree to all the questions that we set them. There were about 12 different questions. So we are quite excited for the future, and we will, as Cyclops, try and get these one or two or three of these councillors to talk at a future meeting. So thank you, Mark, and we will wind up now, but I also want to thank Andy and Leo for hosting the session. It's tricky on Zoom, and but I feel we're getting the hang of it, probably a year and a half on. So Mark, is there anything you want to say kind of in final?
No, I just to thank you. It's always nice to talk about some of these design principles. And I think very much my message is, it isn't always about solving the issue at the point. It's taking a step back and looking at the network.
Yeah.
That's often where the solution lies. Thank you. Yeah.
That's a great message to end with. Thank you very much. And goodbye, everybody.